you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to have helping me this morning, Dan Hershkowitz. He's going to be president of our local association next year, and this year he's currently chairing CAR standard forms. That's been a difficult job for him in the COVID environment. It's moderating monthly phone calls, and but he's doing an excellent job. So I'm very pleased to have him helping me out today. As most of you know, he's also the risk manager head for Compass for Northern California. So very knowledgeable guy, and with an attorney background, although I don't really hold that against him.
Thank you.
Here's our topic today. Finding the forms that you need in zipForm, and looking at the different libraries. And I'm going to give you some tips. I have been very involved in zipForm for 20 years. I was a director of ZipLogix since about 1999, up to a couple of years before it was sold to Lone Wolf. And I do all the QA testing for new forms releases that we have for our local library. So we have in the SFCA library, we have over 50 forms. CAR has probably more than 250 forms. And so I'll be getting into touching on where there's overlap between the two and where you need to pick a particular form out from one of the libraries. If you have any questions, please use the chat, and Dan will be monitoring that and answering. And I have 40 slides in this presentation. I'm going to try and get through in 40 minutes to leave plenty of time for questions. And for you Sarah Cooper fans, you need to translate that to one form a minute, okay? So, finding forms in general. To find a form, follow this thought process. Is the issue a statewide one, or does it relate specifically to San Francisco? And this was quite interesting for me recently, as I am involved in an offer for the first time in many, many years of a sale of one of my listings that is conditioned on the sale of another property. So the buyer has to sell another property first. And of course, for example, that's a good example. That's an issue that can occur statewide, doesn't relate specifically to San Francisco. So the form that the other agent needed is in the CAR library. So sometimes, bullet point number 2, there may be a form that occurs in both libraries. And so Dan and I will try and distinguish the difference between them and which one you might want to use. So bullet point 3 down there, if you're looking for a form, pick a keyword or just a few letters of a keyword that you think that the form title probably includes, and enter a few characters into the zipForm search box. So the search box is on the left here. What I did, just as an example, and captured on the screen, is I entered MULT in the search box while I was looking at the San Francisco library, and it came up with 10 forms that matched. And those are 6 occurrences of our multiple counteroffer form and 4 occurrences of the multiple offers chart. So just it's like searching for a street keyword where you only need to enter a few characters. The danger of entering say Divisadero is that you spell it wrong. But if you just put in DIVIS, it's still gonna MLS is still going to find all the listings on Divisadero. On the right side of this screen, you see that you have the ability to organize libraries in zipForm. And so what I do in my list is I move the San Francisco library to the top of the list. The CAR library is number 2. The California ePubs library is number 3. And it has that strange dues in parentheses after it, which just means it's included in your dues. You don't pay for it. And then number 4, I've got the CAR sample letters, which I've used every now and again. For example, in returning a security deposit to a tenant and explaining why there might be deductions from it. So those are my top 4. This is how you organize the libraries in zipForm. At the top of the dashboard screen, when you first fire up zipForm, you'll see your photo or an image which might be your photo. I don't tend to put my photo on these images. I don't like to see myself staring back at me when I'm working. Click on that image and then click on Profile and Settings. Then click on Forms, click on Organize, and drag and drop the symbol to the left of the library acronym to move a library up or down in the sequence. And by the way, Genevieve will be able to email out these slides to anybody who requests them. So you can either send Genevieve a message directly or again use the chat to request a copy of the slides. So let's move on to some of the forms. The agency disclosure, when do you need that? Well, you need it before a seller signs a listing and before a buyer signs an offer. Where do you find it? Naturally in the CER library. There's no reason for San Francisco to have its own version of the agency disclosure. It's a state mandated form anyway. And there are two versions of it now in the CER library. The AD1 is for the seller's brokerage firm and the seller's agent to give to the seller and have the seller acknowledge. AD2 is for the buyer's brokerage firm and buyer's agent to have the buyer acknowledge. There used to be an AD3 form, but that's no longer required. The civil code was changed so that it's no longer necessary for a selling agent to present another agency form to a seller at the time that they're presenting an offer. And when are you a dual agent? Well, when anyone in your company represents the other party. And Dan may have comments on that later. Okay, purchase agreements. As you know, we have a San Francisco specific purchase agreement in our library. It's a 7-page agreement. We've resisted attempts over the years to increase the number of pages and don't see that as being necessary. But for other California property, you're probably going to want to use the residential purchase agreement in the CER library, which is currently, and Dan will correct me here, I think 12 or 14 pages. And Dan has been supervising a task force to revise that RPA, which is done every 5 years, and that will come out sometime next year, and will potentially increase the number of pages. In addition, CER has an RIPA, which is a residential income purchase agreement, and a probate purchase agreement, and several other purchase agreements for specific uses. So for California, it's a whole suite of purchase agreements. For San Francisco, we've, over the years, developed everything we need into one form. The CER agreements also act as escrow instructions, but typically the San Francisco purchase agreement is not usually submitted to escrow. Although I did just find an escrow officer yesterday requesting it. That's the first time I've heard that for a long time. The CER agreements are bundled with many other forms when you pull them down in zipForm, and we've resisted bundling forms together because you have the facility of templates, with individual templates or your broker templates if you're using the broker edition of zipForms, and that's how you get other forms added to the San Francisco purchase agreement via a template. Counteroffer forms. San Francisco Library, we have 5 occurrences of our counteroffer form, and they all build on the original offer and preceding counteroffers. So they refer to preceding counteroffers as well. The CER library has split the counteroffer function up into a seller's counteroffer and a buyer's counteroffer, and they've got 6 of each in their library. So the SCO through SCO 1 through 6 are counteroffers made by a seller, and they refer to a buyer's purchase agreement or a buyer's counteroffer, but they don't specifically incorporate terms which are not changed. So the language in the California counteroffers is a bit confusing, and I think Dan and I will agree that it's probably better and clearer to use the San Francisco version of this form. Multiple counteroffer forms. CER's got 6, and so do we. And the buyers' names entered at the top of the forms are not the final buyers in the transaction. zipForm allows for a buyer 1 and a buyer 2, and a seller 1 and a seller 2, and that's it. But years ago, I worked with the ZipLogix programmers to figure out how to get multiple buyers into the same transaction to overcome that limitation. And so we came up with thinking of them as completely different fields, not buyer 1, buyer 2, seller 1, seller 2, but we gave them completely different field names so that you can enter more than one name in the same transaction. So you set them up, think of them as competing buyers, and then when you've selected a particular buyer for one of your listings where you've had multiple offers, you need to re-establish buyer 1 and buyer 2 as that winning buyer. And the difference in the forms here is that our MCO form allows who originated the offers to be disclosed to the other buyers' agents to conform with the NAR ethical guidelines that buyers' agents should know if they're competing against, for example, one of your own offers or an offer from someone else in your company. Addenda. In this case, we do not have a local simple addendum form. So you're going to go to the CER library only, and they have 6 occurrences of that addendum form. And 5 years ago, when I was running the CER standard forms, I got them to stop referring to residential purchase agreement at the top of all their forms. So it just says refers to the purchase agreement. So it can be used with a San Francisco purchase agreement as well. And you can also use it with a residential lease or a transfer disclosure statement. So CER library only for the basic addendum form. And then in 2017, CER introduced the AEA 1 through 5, which is useful for amending the terms of an existing agreement. And so that's different. That's from a practice point of view, it's better to do that than attach an addendum when you've got an existing ratified contract. Then CER also has the AOAA form, which you would use if you're substituting the buyer or you're adding the buyer to an existing agreement. And our local library does have some addenda. We have one that we've used, that we've developed for use with the CER RPA, and their probate form and their lease form. So we have 3, in fact, different addenda to conform those CER forms to San Francisco conventions. Backup offers. We've had some debate locally about backup offers. The CER library just has one BUO form, so there's only one copy allowed in a transaction, and that backup buyer can be put in any position, but the limitation is that the lower portion of the form excuse me, assumes that all prior contracts have been cancelled and the backup buyer is immediately placed into first position without any further debate. In the San Francisco library, we've got 4 occurrences of a backup addendum. And they're numbered BOA-B and BOA-S1 through S3. So BOA-B is what you would use if you're representing a buyer and you're submitting an offer when you know the property is already ratified. BOA-S1 through S3 is for a seller to invite up to 3 different buyers to be in backup position. And the lower portion of that of the forms extends an invitation to a buyer to be elevated to primary position or to a higher backup. So it's an invitation. It's not a you're not immediately putting them into a contract, but you're giving them a second chance to say whether or not they still wish to purchase the property. And locally, we, as I said, we debated this at the last couple of forms meetings, and we think that the San Francisco form is more flexible. Contingency removals. Here's another case where each library's got contingency removal forms. We have 4 and they refer to paragraph numbers in our purchase agreement. And the bottom of the form makes it clear that the all box is just a convenience for the buyer and is not a requirement of the contract, contrary to what some listing agents have tried to suggest. And the CER library, they have 3, and they also refer specifically to their paragraph numbers in the RPA. And they can, there's also a request for repair forms and a response to requests for repair forms in the CER library. So you'd use the appropriate contingency removal form for the agreement that is in your transaction. Termination of an agreement. We have a TOA form, termination of an agreement and release of deposit, which can be used by either side. And the CER has a CC form, cancellation of contract. And both forms imply that a notice to perform was previously issued to the other party. And those generally give 2 days for someone to perform according to the contract. And both forms provide for the termination of the escrow and a determination of who gets what money from which might be on deposit. Parking and storage disclosure form. We retired our form.
Before we go on to parking and storage, I've been answering a couple of questions in the chat, and I just want to touch base on them. Sure. One, there were 2 questions asking why the San Francisco counteroffer may be your preference over the car counteroffer. And one thing I did do was I typed into the chat that the San Francisco counteroffer is just a little bit different from the car. Our San Francisco automatically adjusts the deposits and the loan amounts, so the 3% remains 3% even if the price is increased. The car does not do that. So if it's $1 million house and a $30,000 initial deposit, that $30,000 initial deposit will stay that way. That was one thing. Someone else asked, why are there multiple versions of the same form? They were concerned that there were out-of-date versions. And what I explained was that we have multiple instances of one form. We never have an out-of-date form. So we may have counteroffer 1, 2, 3, and 4 because we may be sending out several of them in the same transaction, and we don't have to overwrite or override any of them. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you for that. A point about out-of-date forms. If you pull in a form from any of the libraries, you will only ever get the current version of the form. You'll never get an out-of-date version of it. And even if in a template you haven't changed the template, but one of the forms in your template has been updated, when the template's applied to a transaction, the software will only ever apply the latest version of the form. So in theory, you don't even need to update your templates, although I always do.
And so when I see an old out-of-date form in a new transaction, what I realized that happened is that they've gone ahead and they've simply copied and pasted or renamed an old transaction. So they changed 123 Main Street to 315 Harrison. And because they did it that way, what they did was they just copied all of the old out-of-date forms. Had they started a new transaction and applied a template, it would have had all of the automatic updates.
That's a great point. Some people will copy a transaction if they've got complicated buyers' names or they're writing up a sequence of offers for the same buyers. But if you do that, and if it's been a while and you think the form's been updated, you can copy the transaction and then delete the form from the transaction. So delete the purchase agreement from the transaction. You won't lose any data because as I'll explain later how zipForm works. But you delete the form and then re-add it from the library, and you'll be adding back the latest version, and you'll find that all the data has been translated across. The way that zipForm works is it doesn't keep form images in a transaction. So what it keeps is a reference to a form and all the data fields that go with those forms. And when you go to export a form to a PDF or for electronic signature, it matches up the latest version of the form, it matches up the version of the form that's in your transaction at the time with the fields that have been saved. And as you know, you can define a field in any form, and if you go to another form that uses the same field, you'll find that the data is already there. So that's an explanation, a quick explanation of how zipForm works. Back to this parking and storage disclosure. As I was saying, we retired our local form a few years ago when CER's parking and storage disclosure (PSD) was developed and essentially accomplished or covered everything that our form did. So that gave us a reason to retire our local form. It is our objective not to have duplicate forms unless it's strictly necessary. So on disclosure forms, transfer disclosure, and for sellers who are exempt from completing a transfer disclosure statement, CER has the exempt seller disclosure form. They also have a lead-based paint disclosure and addendum, and of course the agent's visual inspection forms. In the San Francisco library, we have a local San Francisco seller disclosure, which has just been restructured into 3 sections, now 6 pages long. And all the questions that no seller is exempt from are in our form in section 1. And then we also have our own version of a residential earthquake risk disclosure form with additional questions that are not in the state booklet about gas supply, which is pretty critical for those of us who live in the marina. So moving on, trust considerations. CER library's got a trust advisory, which should be reviewed with the seller. The seller may be exempt from completing a TDS if the trustee is a third party not related to the beneficiaries. However, you still need, no one's exempt from certain questions, so you still need that exempt seller disclosure form to be completed. And then CER has representative capacity signature disclosure forms for sellers and buyers, which provide for a trustee or someone with a power of attorney to define what their role is and sign as representing the seller or buyer in the transaction. Other advisories. CER's got the whole host of advisories. The SBSA we're all familiar with. The new this year California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, wire fraud advisory, sellers advisory, sellers disclosure information advisory, the BIA, the buyer's inspection advisory, the market conditions advisory for both sides, and the PRBS, possible representation by your company of more than one buyer or seller. In San Francisco, we have our own disclosures and disclaimers advisory, locally known as GIPS, General Information. That was its old name. And it's a supplement to the CER SBSA, and we don't repeat any information that's in the SBSA. So you always need the SBSA as well. The booklets, this is where this EPUBs library comes in. This library has the booklets, residential environmental hazards, lead hazards, home energy rating, and the homeowner's guide to earthquake safety, which just got updated in July after 15 years of the previous version being in the library. So also in the EPUBs library, there's a signature page for each of those booklets, but we also have a local form, AORB, which you can use to have a principal sign off on several of the booklets on one form. And then in the local library, we have the DPI San Francisco Energy and Water Conservation booklet. So now we get on to some interesting forms that may not be generally known. And I'm going to show you versions of these, which will be fairly tough to read since I'm trying to put a whole page on a PowerPoint slide. But there's a purchase agreement worksheet called the pause form, and that allows you to set up the financing structure for a contract. If you start off by putting the dollar amount on the form, then it will show you what 3% is, what 85% is, 80%, and you just check the appropriate box, and it will move the financing terms up to the top of that form. And then when you go back to the contract itself, you'll see that the financing terms are entered into the contract for you. So that's a neat little worksheet, and we also put one together for CER. So there's one of those in each library. Then there's a summary of offer form. This one you can't enter any data into. What it does is it extracts the highlights of an offer onto a summary page. And that can be quite useful. Looking at that summary page, you can quickly see if you've left out anything significant like a closing date. And again, CER, once we developed ours in San Francisco, CER put a summary page together for the RPA and the RIPA. And multiple offer charts. We have 4. We started off with just 2, which allowed up to 12 competing offers to be compared in the same transaction. And then a couple of years ago, I had 22 offers on one of my listings. So we put together multiple offer 3 and multiple offer chart 4. And then, of course, the market died after that. So you can blame me for that. CER has, again, 4 forms, but they only have 5 per page, which allow up to 20 offers. So now I'm going to show you what those forms look like. This is the purchase agreement worksheet. Once you type in the purchase price dollar amount in the top, then the financing structure dollars get completed. So once it knows what the price is, then it can enter in all those numbers at the bottom of the form. And then on the right, in the bottom section, there's a checkbox, and you just pick the one that you want. So, for example, 3% of the purchase price is the initial deposit. 75% of the purchase price is one of the loan amounts, and you can enter it either as a contingent loan, a new first loan, or non-contingent financing by checking the appropriate box.
So, David, the question I think people will have is, when you fill this out, does it translate this for you into your purchase agreement, or is it just giving you the numbers and you need to go and enter them yourself?
No, once you've checked the appropriate boxes, you'll see the numbers at the top of this form, and then when you go back to the purchase agreement, you'll see that the numbers are put in because it's the same fields. We've defined the top of this form to be the same fields as on the purchase agreements.
And so this will be used to actually fill out your purchase agreement then for you, sort of like a fast fill, but it does the math for you.
Exactly. Okay. This form's doing the math for you, and then it's translating the numbers onto the purchase agreement.
And do you need to pull the purchase agreement into your transaction first before you pull this up?
No, that wouldn't be necessary. The fields are the fields, and once you pull the purchase agreement into the transaction, if it's not already there, it'll come in, and you'll see the numbers in the form.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the summary of offer form, and as I said, you can't enter it as a buyer's agent. You can't enter any information. It's going to pick up all of the fields from the purchase agreement. So this is a neat summary, useful for yourself and your buyer, and can also be useful if you send it to the listing agent with your offer. And then there's a section at the bottom where the listing agent can make some notes, but these are not open to the buyer's agent to enter any information there. This is a multiple offer chart. This is our multiple offer chart number 4. So this is for offers 19 through 24. If you're fortunate or unfortunate enough to receive that many offers on a listing. And this you do enter, as a listing agent, you do enter all the information from your offers, and you can put in some free-form notes at the bottom, but useful as a record for your seller if you're sifting through that many offers, and useful as a record for your file that you properly accounted for all of the offers that were emailed to you. Okay, other useful forms. CER has a couple of forms that that I developed back in the 2000s, I think 2006. One's for buyer costs and the other's for estimated seller proceeds. And there's 3 copies of each that can be added to a transaction. This is the buyer's cost. You can see the revision date at the top of it. It's one of those forms I like to think of. If you get it right the first time, then you don't have to go back changes to it. So this is where you can enter the costs, and if I think some of these fields do match if they're already in your transactions, you might find some of the data is already there. One significant thing here, the box at the bottom right, the estimated monthly payments. I got ZipLogics at the time to incorporate a mortgage calculator in this form. They had a separate mortgage calculator, but it was independent. It wasn't related to any form, but now it does work in this form. So you can show your buyer what the monthly payments are going to be on this purchase at these projected prices. And again, you can have 3 versions of this form in the transaction. This is the seller form, and this shows what the charges are from the lenders, what any escrow fees, transfer tax, payoff demands, and what the estimated proceeds are going to be. And again, you can flex this at different prices to show the seller what their net is going to be at different prices. So San Francisco only forms, useful forms. We have a few. We have the acknowledgement of booklets. We have an as-is addendum.
No, David, I'm sorry, before we do the San Francisco only forms, it dovetails into a question that we just had. Someone was asking if we could, in fact, outline all of the required disclosure forms different between San Francisco and CAR. And what I was trying to explain in the chat was that CAR and all of its forms are intended to meet the state requirements. And so depending on the property type, et cetera, there are many state statutory requirements. San Francisco has additional forms, as do some of the others, the East Bay, for instance, and some others, that meet the local requirements. So in addition to statewide requirements, we also have some local requirements, and you're about to go through some of those. If you're looking for a property type and trying to figure out what's required, I would start with the CAR disclosure charts, which explain the property type and ownership status and what's required and what isn't. And then your local knowledge is going to be important for our local forms. And we do have somewhere a list of all of the local forms and what they're used for and when they're used. I'm not sure where that chart is, but it's somewhere at our SFAR website. Okay, thank you, David.
Well, you put that local chart together, the local disclosure chart, and a couple of years ago, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah, and I've got a copy of it. Marvik's got a copy of it. Probably we should wheel it out again and see if it needs updating.
Right.
But it's a nice piece of work.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So as I was saying, we have a 2-page now local as-is addendum. We have our own residential earthquake checklist, used to be called residential hazards report. We have our own square footage and lot size disclosure, and we have a transfer tax calculator as well. And I'm going to show you a couple of those. This is the acknowledgement of booklets form. This is the as-is addendum, which went from 1 page to 2 pages last year. And this is our square footage and lot size disclosure, which lets you check what the sources are of the figures that you've got, lets you add a couple that we hadn't thought of, and warns buyers that no one's checking these numbers and there is no such a thing as the square footage on any property. 2 different appraisers are without doubt going to come up with 2 different numbers. This is the update to match the 2020 version of the earthquake guide that just came out. So you see the reference to the page numbers in the guide on the right-hand column. and the questions at the bottom, question 9 and the 4 in number 10. Those are additional questions that we think are highly relevant for San Francisco properties that are not in the statewide guide, which basically is looking at single-family homes statewide. We have many more types of property than that in San Francisco. This is the transfer tax advisory and calculation form, and this is quite neat. It works in both directions. If you put in your sale price in the left chart and the yellow, you just got to figure out the right row to put it in, matching the price that you got, and then it will calculate and show you how much transfer tax is due on that sale. But it also works in the reverse direction. If you come across a grant deed where it wasn't obvious what the sale price was, and now the transfer tax must be shown on grant deeds, you can plug that transfer tax paid amount in the right-hand chart, and it will show you what the sale price was. And we update this as the local supervisors and try and charge or do charge higher transfer tax rates in certain price ranges. We'll keep this chart up to date. Then we have individual unit forms. We have for condominiums and co-ops, we have a financial disclosure. We have a form for the sale of first sale of a converted condominium unit. And these units may have been converted 20 years ago, but still held as income property. But if it turns out this is the first sale of a converted condominium unit, you need to complete this CONV form. And then at Dan's instigation, we developed a HOA docs form, an advisory of unavailable documents that you might expect, but which either can't be found or don't exist for a particular association. For co-ops, we have a cooperative apartment purchase addendum to go with our purchase agreement. And for TICs, with the help of local attorneys like Andy Serkin and local TIC specialists like Tim Brown, we've put together a TIC advisory and a TIC purchase addendum and a TIC financial disclosure we added a couple of years ago. Do you have any comments on those, Dan?
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
On the TIC advisory? Well, you know what's interesting?
On any of that list.
What's interesting is that CAR's adopting a TIC purchase addendum as well, because we're seeing more and more down south, and the same with the co-op. But no, the one thing I do say with the condominium financial disclosure statement, often what we have is a practical matter, an HOA not cooperating with you in providing one. And what I've often said to the buyer's agent is, what are they providing? Are they providing a lender questionnaire? Because compare the two, often they're exactly the same. So long as your buyer client has all of that information, we don't really care if it comes on our form or on the lender questionnaire.
Yep. Okay, thank you for that. Tenancy forms for income property or even single family homes which are rented. First off, we don't have our own lease form, and in San Francisco we don't recommend use of the CER residential lease. What we recommend is the SFAA, San Francisco Apartment Association lease, which is not on zipForm yet, although we're working on it. But we do have a form fillable PDF, which is available on the sfrealtors.com website. In the CR library, they have a notice of sale and entry for tenants and a notice of entry to put the tenants on notice that the unit will be shown. And those are useful forms. In the San Francisco library, we have an estoppel certificate, used to be called a RIQ, Rental Information Questionnaire. We revised the title last year and added made some questions more specific. So that is now an essential for a rented unit. And then if you you've got tenants who've been there more than 5 years, you might want to use the request for information to determine whether or not they're protected. We also have a rent increase calculation form, which I'll show you, and a security deposit calculation form to calculate the interest owed to a tenant when they leave a unit. So this is the revised estoppel certificate. Again, it's tough probably on your screens to read all of this, but I'm just encouraging you to pull these forms off a zipForm, and if you're not familiar with them, and bear them in mind when you get into a situation you might not have been involved in before. This is the question, the form that tries to solicit whether or not the tenant is a member of a protected class. Then this is the rent increase calculation form. This is just got updated this year. The rent increase limit, line 2 on the chart on the bottom left. If you're about to put through an increase that's more than 10% of the prior rent, you now need to give 90 days notice. It used to be 60 days notice before January 1 this year, but it's 90 days notice now. And of course, those of you who are actively involved in increases will know there's a moratorium on actually passing through any, even an allowable rent increase right now. That moratorium goes, I think, for another 4 days till the 22nd, but is most likely to get extended.
There's also a concern, David, on gouging and anti-gouging state of emergency rules. So if I was going to be increasing the rent by more than 10%, I'd be talking with a local qualified landlord attorney for fear that I'd be messing that up.
Yeah. Security deposits. Routinely, I find that landlords aren't paying the annual interest that is owed on the security deposit, but they're letting it accrue, and then they catch up when the tenant leaves the unit. So this form helps you calculate, and by showing you what the security deposit interest rates were for different periods. That's the chart on the left. And then the chart on the right kind of reminds them that they are allowed to offset 50% of the annual fee that's charged by the rent board so they can reclaim 50% of that fee from the tenant who's in place on November 1st of each year. So the form does the complete calculation and then shows you at the bottom what the remaining amount is that is owed to the tenant after they leave. And this becomes input to the consideration of whether or not there's any damage in the unit and other considerations that this form doesn't address. So other set of tenancy forms that we have in our library, we have a tenant's rights disclosure, which has to be given by a seller to tenants, and also has to be given by a buyer after close of escrow to the tenants. If you've got vacant unit disclosures, you know that you have to account for those vacant units, why they became vacant, and you have to have that form available at all showings. If you've been involved in buyout negotiations, you need to complete the TBLA form. And then finally, if you've got an investment property, paragraph 14 of our purchase agreement is going to ask for a lot of answers to questions that are specified on the SRPS form. This time last year, Dan and I were elsewhere developing the COPA forms, and so we have at the moment 13 of them. This was an interesting exercise. The advisory was largely written by Alex Wine, the association's attorney, and Dan and I had a lot of input to 1 through 9 in sequence, which you might need them if you're dealing with a 3+ unit building that has to be offered to qualified non-profits before you can market it directly. COPA 9, the form that you use after the property's closed escrow, the sellers swearing up and down that they complied with all the regulations. COPA 9 was interesting. Dan and I put a version together. Then Alex Wyant rewrote it, and then the day that we were going to release all the forms, we found that the city had produced their own version. So that went through 3 iterations. Then following that, we put together a cut down purchase agreement, cut down from 7 pages to 4 pages to be more seller friendly if the seller's having to sell to one of these qualified non-profits, and recognizing that it's an investment property, so you don't need anything to do with condominiums or TICs. So that's a 4-page purchase agreement you can use for the sale of a 3+ unit building to one of the non-profits. And it's basically written actually for 5+ units. So we put together an addendum that for 3 and 4 unit buildings where things like a transfer disclosure statement do still apply, there's a state regulation. And then to bring us up to date for this year, we need to talk about the COVID forms. CAR, as I'm sure everybody knows by now, has the property entry and advisory forms. They've got 2 for the seller occupants and 10 visitor forms in it that you can put in a transaction. And they've also got lease rental versions. And then in the CAR library now, they have a coronavirus addendum or amendment form, which you can use to attach to a purchase offer, or you can use it later as an amendment to a ratified contract. And they have a lease rental version of that as well. In San Francisco, when this first became an issue, we put together an emergency amendment form. So we designed it for use with a ratified contract if the expected timeframes need to be extended or the buyer needs to terminate the contract. So we put a local form together which is very specific and is still in use now. It assumes that in putting a purchase agreement together as a buyer's agent, you anticipated all the timeframes that you need to get appraisers in the property to get your inspections done. But in the event you still need more time for a specific reason, you can use this COBAN form. And that's the presentation. You know, we keep our forms up to date by adopting suggestions from agents such as yourselves. For CAR forms, send your comments to forms@car.org, and they're reviewed on CAR forms committee calls during the year. In fact, we have one of those this afternoon. For San Francisco forms, send your comments to forms@sfrealtors.com, and we'll get them on the agenda to review at our monthly meeting. And that's it. Dan, do you have any questions?
Well, I'm looking at the chat and I've been trying to answer some of them. One asked about an automatic shutoff valve and when did this become a new law? And I'm not sure where we said that it was, but what I answered was there is no point of sale requirement in San Francisco for an automatic gas shutoff valve. However, some cities do have such requirements and some lenders do have their own requirements. But as of right now, there's no point of sale requirement in San Francisco. Am I right on that?
That's as far as I know, yes. That is a question on the one of the extended questions in number 10 on our residential earthquake risk form, whether or not you have one. But I'm 99.9% sure that it's not a local requirement, and I haven't come across a lender on a San Francisco property requiring one either. But I'm sure you're correct. I'm sure there are some jurisdictions where it's become a requirement.
Yeah, down south I know for sure. In the LA area, there are several cities that require it. LA being, I think, one of them. Okay.
Yeah. And of course, in Northern California, you know, natural gas usage is becoming less and less common as different jurisdictions are requiring all electric.
That is true, right? And so it's interesting to find out whether or not in the future, whether or not that will broaden as a result. I think eventually we'll see a state rule that says no more natural gas. Okay,
Anything else in the chat?
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, believe it or not.
Well, then we ended 10 minutes early.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of thank yous for your fantastic presentation, David.
All right. And these slides are available from Genevieve. So.
All right, thank you, Mr. Parry, and congratulations on your new Sotheby's.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.